Hello, welcome to Leisrealtalk. Today I want to share with you one of the most astonishing East meets West cultural legacy in the world. It began in China more than 1,000 years ago, long before the term global trade or international diplomacy ever existed. One early morning in 2016, a small crowd began to gather at the Western Wall Plaza in Jerusalem. Among them were both tourists and local Jewish worshippers. The tourists would approach the wall, strike a few poses, snap some quick photos, and leave. The locals, however, would place both hands gently on the ancient stones, some pressing their foreheads against the wall, quietly praying. On that particular morning in 2016, 5 young Chinese women quietly approached the wall. At first, no one paid them much attention, assuming they were just tourists. But then something unexpected happened. The women placed their hands on the wall, bowed their heads, and began to pray. This caught everyone's attention. Who were they? Why were they praying like devout Jews? To answer that question, we need to go back in time, centuries back. The story began in the 17th century when a Catholic missionary arrived in the capital of the Ming Dynasty, Beijing. He came from Italy and his name was Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit priest under the Catholic Church. He would unknowingly plant the seeds of a connection that would one day link Chinese people to an ancient, faraway faith. Appointed by the Vatican, Ricci arrived in China during the reign of Ming Emperor Shenzhong, more commonly remembered as the Wanli Emperor. He was the 13th emperor of the Ming Dynasty and also the longest reigning, holding the throne for 48 years. Wanli became emperor at the age of 10. Under the guidance of the brilliant statesman Zhang Juzheng, the young emperor initiated a wave of reforms that temporarily revitalized the dynasty, a period known as the Wanli New Deal. During this time, the Ming Dynasty made notable strides in economics, military strength, and culture. However, by the time Matteo Ricci entered Beijing in 1601, Zhang Juzheng had already died, and the emperor, then 38 years old, was no longer the reform-minded ruler of his youth. He had become reclusive and indulgent, detached from state affairs, and the Ming court was surviving mostly on the momentum of past glory. Still, Ricci was deeply impressed by what he found in China. He had traveled a long road to get there, from Lisbon to India, then by sea to Guangzhou, followed by a stop in Nanjing, and finally the journey north to Beijing. To Ricci, China was a land of abundance and refinement. By the time he reached Beijing, Ricci had already spent years in China and became fluent in Chinese. His goal now was to gain an audience with the emperor. He knew that only with the emperor's blessing could he continue his missionary work and establish a lasting presence. Of course, you don't visit the emperor empty-handed. In addition to obtaining the support of local officials, Ricci also brought gifts. He presented a chiming clock, a copy of the Bible, and a world map. The moment Wanli saw the chiming clock, he was fascinated. He immediately appointed Ricci as the court clockmaker. The emperor also granted him a plot of land in Beijing, on which Ricci built the first Catholic church in the capital. From then on, Father Ricci established deep roots in Beijing. He formed close ties with government officials, scholars, and elites, and quickly gained hundreds of converts. His dedication to learning Confucian philosophy and his ability to converse eloquently on Chinese classics earned him respect in upper circles. About 4 years later, in 1605, something unexpected happened. One day, a visitor arrived at Father Ricci's church in Beijing. Ricci was immediately struck by the man's appearance. He didn't look like most Chinese people. The man had deep-set eyes and a high nose, features that resembled Ricci's own more than the locals. His visitor's name was Aitian. Before Ricci could even ask who he was, Aitian excitedly said, "I believe in the one true God you speak of." He then pointed to a painting, one depicting the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, and asked, "Are they Rebecca and Jacob?" This took Ricci completely by surprise. In the Bible, Rebecca is a matriarch and prophet, the daughter-in-law of Abraham and the wife of Isaac. His son, Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, is the forefather of the Israelites. For someone to reference these names and even know the family lineage was astounding. Ricci was stunned. Had someone in Ming China read the Bible before him? Even in Europe at the time, very few people were literate, and most believers learned about the Bible by listening to priests during Mass. Yet here was a man in Beijing who not only knew the names and stories from the Old Testament, but seemed to know them well. For a moment, Ricci even wondered whether this man had been secretly sent by the Vatican to China before him. But he quickly dismissed the idea. Ricci knew with certainty that he was the first missionary officially dispatched to China. Still, something didn't add up. Aitian's understanding of the Bible was deep, but his interpretations were slightly off. For example, no one familiar with Christian iconography would confuse the Virgin Mary and Jesus with Rebecca and Jacob. So, who was this man really? Just as Ricci was full of questions, Aitian began to tell a story so incredible that Ricci could hardly believe his ears. At the end of the 9th century AD, several hundred Persian merchants made their way to China by traveling along the overland Silk Road. Eventually, they arrived in Bianzhou, a prosperous city in the Tang Dynasty that would later become Kaifeng. They were pleasantly surprised by what they found, a wealthy, peaceful place with kind-hearted people. It didn't take long for them to make a decision. They would settle there. Strategically located along the Grand Canal, Kaifeng was a major hub for commerce and military power in northern China. It was chosen as the capital of the Northern Song dynasty and blossomed into one of the most prosperous cities in the world at the time, with a population exceeding 1 million. The famous painting along the river during the Qingming festival depicts the city's vibrant life, bustling markets, lively streets, and a flourishing urban culture. So when Aitian told Ricci that his Persian ancestors had chosen to settle in Kaifeng, Ricci wasn't surprised. What did surprise him, however, was what came next. These Persian settlers had lived in Kaifeng for hundreds of years, and yet they had not been assimilated into Han Chinese society. Instead, they had preserved their own culture and built a strong, close-knit community. That was extremely rare in China's long history. Ricci had studied Chinese history and culture in depth to better navigate on his mission in China. He had come to the conclusion that Chinese civilization was not only inclusive, but had immense assimilative power. Ancient texts like the Book of Documents have accounts of tribes from the east, south, west, and north, Dongyi, Nanmen, Xirong, Beidi, that were all eventually absorbed into the Chinese cultural sphere. So the fact that just a few hundred Persian merchants could live among a massive Han population for centuries without being culturally absorbed was astonishing to Ricci. He was stunned until Aitian revealed a small but crucial detail. He said that his people had a special dietary custom. They never ate the sinews from the legs of cattle or sheep. Whenever they bought meat, they would ask the butcher to remove all the tendons. Locals in Kaifeng found this habit strange and even gave them a nickname, the tendon pickers. The moment Ricci heard this, everything clicked. The book of Genesis describes how Jacob wrestled with an angel. During the struggle, the angel touched the socket of Jacob's hip. From then on, Jews refrained from eating sinew. That's when Ricci finally understood. Aitian's ancestors were not just Persian merchants, they were Persian Jews. It was their unique religious faith, Judaism, that held their community together and preserved their cultural identity, even while surrounded by Han Chinese for centuries. They had never been exposed to Christianity and were unfamiliar with Christian theology. That's why Ai Tian had mistaken the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus in the church painting for Rebecca and Jacob, figures from the Old Testament. Now, realizing the importance of this discovery, Ricci immediately sent people to Kaifeng. He didn't just want to verify Ai Tian's story, he had a bigger goal. He hoped to obtain ancient copies of the Hebrew Bible from the Kaifeng Jewish community. Such texts would hold great value for the Vatican, not only religiously but historically. Just as Ricci had hoped, the representatives he sent to Kaifeng found exactly what Ai Tian had described, a Jewish community nearly 5,000 strong. At the heart of this community stood a grand synagogue known as the Temple of Revering the Scriptures, where they preserved ancient scrolls of the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah. The community referred to their religion as 依次乐业教. It turns out the phrase was a transliteration of the Hebrew name for Israel. In other words, they were saying, we follow the religion of Israel. The Kaifeng Jews observed the Sabbath every 7th day, just as in Jewish tradition. They continue this custom faithfully week after week as part of their religious practice. To better integrate into local society while preserving their identity, the Kaifeng Jews adopted 17 common Han Chinese surnames, including Li, Shi, and Ai. These weren't random choices. Li was derived from Levi. Shi came from Shabbat. Ai was a transliteration of Adam. And their most important annual holiday wasn't the Chinese New Year, it was Passover. The Kaifeng Jews were never discriminated against. In fact, their descendants had the same rights as any Chinese. They could sit for the imperial civil service exams, and if they passed, they could serve as officials in the Ming court. One well-documented example was a man named Zuo Tang, a descendant of the Kaifeng Jewish community who later moved to Yangzhou. In 1495, during the reign of the Zongzhi Emperor, Zuo Tang took the imperial exams and passed with distinction. Out of nearly 300 candidates nationwide, he ranked 11th, earning the prestigious title of Jingshi and officially entering the Ming bureaucracy. The Kaifeng Jewish community also maintained meticulous genealogical records. Ricci's envoys examined these family histories and saw for themselves the ancient Torah scrolls housed in the synagogue. Everything Ai Tian said was true. This discovery confirmed beyond doubt the so-called 依斯勒耶教 was a genuine branch of ancient Judaism in China. Ricci later documented the entire encounter in his autobiography and reported it directly to the Vatican. And just like that, both China and the Western world learned of an ancient Jewish community, faithfully preserving its culture and religion for generations in the eastern city of Kaifeng. News of this spread far and wide. Jews living in Guangzhou and along China's southern coast heard about the Kaifeng community and began migrating there, strengthening the Jewish presence in the city even more. However, life wasn't always smooth for the Kaifeng Jews. Their peaceful days were often interrupted by natural disasters. As mentioned earlier, Kaifeng rose to prominence thanks to its position along the Grand Canal, especially the Tongji Canal, which connected the Yellow River and the Huai River. But there was a problem. The Yellow River is notoriously unstable, changing course and causing massive floods. Over the past 2,000 years, Kaifeng was flooded at least 7 times. Yet the resilient Jewish community of Kaifeng always returned. After each disaster and temporary flight, they returned to rebuild their homes and synagogue. During the Kangxi era of the Qing dynasty, after surviving another major flood, the Kaifeng Jews returned and built an even larger synagogue. Its fame grew so much that Catholic missionaries who later arrived in China came to Kaifeng just to see it. One even sketched a drawing of the grand building. Today, that sketch is preserved in the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora in Tel Aviv. The young Chinese women praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 2016 were descendants of the Kaifeng Jewish community. Though outwardly they looked no different from other Chinese women, they had grown up studying ancient Hebrew, reading the 5 books of Moses, and celebrating Passover, just like their ancestors had done for centuries. But everything began to change after the rise of communism in China. In today's China, these young women can no longer attend synagogue services. All Jewish places of worship have been shut down, and their religious symbols were forcibly removed. Jews in Kaifeng are no longer allowed to observe Passover or read Hebrew scriptures aloud. Surveillance cameras now cover every corner of the community's narrow streets, and any Jewish gathering is treated as potential threat of foreign infiltration. Under such conditions, the Kaifeng Jews, who had lived and thrived in China for over 1,000 years, began to seriously consider leaving. Some members of the community managed to circumvent China's internet firewall and connect with the outside world. That's how they discovered an NGO called Shavei Israel, an organization dedicated to helping Jews who are living in countries with restricted religious freedom to return to Israel. When the NGO heard of the Kaifeng Jews' story, they were deeply moved and immediately began working to help them leave China. After 4 years of effort, they successfully helped 19 Kaifeng Jews immigrate to Israel. The 5 young women at the Western Wall were part of the first group. When Israeli reporters asked them whether they planned to return to Kaifeng someday, the young women showed a flicker of emotion. But in the end, they simply shook their heads in silence. They said they would rather stay in a land where they could practice their faith freely than return to the place they once called home. I hope you found this story as inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed my program, please like and subscribe for more. That's all for today. See you next time.